Welcome to the Contemporary South Asia podcast, the audio companion to the journal Contemporary South Asia, published by Taylor and Francis. Each episode, we engage with scholarship that examines the politics, societies, and cultures of South Asia in their global and historical contexts. Through conversations with authors and experts, we highlight key debates, emerging research, and critical perspectives that shape understandings of the region today. Our aim is to extend the dialogue beyond the page, opening the journal's work to a wider audience of scholars, students, and interested listeners. My name's Dr. Thomas Chambers. I'm an Associate Professor of Social Anthropology at Oxford Brookes University. Today's guest is Dr. Anam Kuraishi. Anam's article is titled Talking Post-Truth, Elite Rhetoric on Democracy in Pakistan. It was published in Contemporary South Asia in Volume 33, Issue 3 in 2025. Anam is a assistant professor in political science at Lahore University of Management Studies, LUMS. She did her PhD in political science from the University of Essex in 2022 and an MSc in comparative politics from the London School of Economics and Political Science in 2016. Her research focuses on political behaviour and politics of South Asia. In particular, she examines citizens' democratic commitments and how rhetoric and misinformation shape public opinion. Adjacent to this, she is also working on themes related to gender and climate change. She develops research designs using a variety of data and methods, including experimental and survey methods, content analysis, observational data, and interviews. She is the author of the book Towards a New Paradigm on Post-Truth, and she has previously served as a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Antwerp and a visiting research fellow at Collegio Carlo Alberto in Italy, VDEM Institute at Aarhus University. She is also teaching an associate fellow, at the Institute of Development and Economic Alternatives, where she has worked on projects on child marriages and women's political participation. Anam, welcome to the Contemporary South Asia podcast. It's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Hello, Tom. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited for this conversation.
Fantastic. Anam, we're going to be talking about your article, Talking Post-Truth, Elite Rhetoric on Democracy in Pakistan. I wonder, Anam, if I could just ask you to begin with by just setting the scene a little bit for us, telling us a little bit about, where we are, the sort of context, the background, just that sort of detail to give the listener a bit of a sense of where we are with things.
Of course. So post-truth became a buzzword in 2016, actually, with the advent of Brexit and then Trump's first election campaign. And that's where the word just gained a lot of prominence to the extent that Oxford Dictionary named it Word of the Year. And the way that it was understood at that time was primarily, it's something where objective facts become less relevant and emotional appeals take precedence in shaping public opinion. And so a lot of literature that came out around that time, a lot of books or mainstream media started looking at post-truth as this dichotomy between what's truth and what's beyond truth. So the post essentially just garnered this negative association with the concept of post-truth and then slowly it became linked to the crisis of democracy, that truth being this cornerstone of liberal democracies is somehow being attacked now. And so democracy is under attack. And with a lot of the type of campaigns that we saw with Trump, with Brexit, it came to that point where it was like, there is something actually something happening with politics in a way where nobody cares about truth anymore. And we're in a post-truth era. And that's where I started. I mean, that was the context where when I started researching in post-truth was looking at it. Is that it? Is post-truth as simple as dichotomizing truth with something that's beyond it? Or is there something more to it? Because lying or exaggerating or emotional appeals have always existed in politics. That's not something new. So what is it that made Trump come into power? What is it that made actually Brexit really happen or come to fruition at that point? And so looking at, and then that is where I started reconceptualizing post-truth. And that's what I do in my work as well, where let's not look at post-truth as just this an opposition to truth. Let's think of it as a type of political discourse. And when you start thinking about it as a political discourse that is structured or that articulates a desire, something to actually aspire for, the understanding of truthfulness or what really truthfulness is somewhat becomes obsolete, because truthfulness then is being measured in a way with regarding to the relevance of desire or this aspirational desire that you want to achieve. And so post-truth then becomes a type of political discourse that is really advocating for this aspirational desire where it intertwines with emotions to then really create a sense of belonging, a yearning for fulfillment of that desire. And that's what then, and taking that lens then, where it's the rhetoric of desire, how it intertwines with emotions, how it's able to really position or incorporate citizens or their perceptions within this entire narrative that is being constructed, is where we start questioning the idea of whether post-truth can be more than just a negative aspect. If it is a discourse that is articulating desire, can that discourse then not only undermine democracy, but also bolster democracy? And I think with this particular piece, then that's basically what I'm trying to really tease out is like, can post-truth actually be a mobilizing strategy when we look at the type or when we look at elections in Pakistan or electoral discourse in Pakistan? Do we see those elements where post-truth is actually facilitating a democratic episode in the country? And if it is, then what is it? What do we learn from post-truth as a concept? How do we understand different tactics that politicians can use, whether it's still relevant, whether this explains the rise of populist leaders to an extent, whether it actually leads to reevaluating what we understand as the crisis of democracy? Is post-truth actually a cause for this crisis or not? And so that's the premise of course, my work as well, where I'm trying to understand or look at post-truth from a very different perspective. And one of the things that I talk about in the article as well, it's like the dichotomy of fake news and objective truth somehow falls flat, because if there's a discourse or post-truth is a discourse that is structured around desire, how do you falsify a desire? How do you factually verify a desire, right? So like that entire conversation that really dichotomizes objective truth and fake news, and that's the length that we understand post-truth from, it becomes somewhat irrelevant to this discussion. We've just opened up a new chapter where we're like, okay, post-truth is completely different than how we've come to understand it. It's not this dichotomy. Instead, it's actually a type of political discourse. And we need to really unpack the type of political discourse that it is in order to move on, in order to understand how it influences democratization, whether it undermines it, whether it supports or facilitates it. And of course, I'm happy to talk a little bit more about the actual case of Pakistan, where we see that post-truth is not being used in a negative sense at all.
Sorry. I mean, before we go into sort of the particulars of post-truth in Pakistan, it might be useful for listeners just to get a little bit of a sense of, I mean, obviously there's a long history, but in a sort of very summarized kind of way, a little bit of a sense of sort of the history of Pakistani democracy, which obviously has been through, some very turbulent times over the years. Could you just give us a little bit of a framing of the background that was sort of, situating this in terms of the geographical location?
Of course. So Pakistan has actually it has a very turbulent history of democratically elected governments, because there has been the involvement of military dictatorships in the political sphere as well. And this has been the case since independence, where you've had episodes of military dictatorship and then episodes of democratically elected government. The time period that I'm looking at as well, between 2008 and 2018, we've actually seen that. So we've seen the ousting of a military dictator and then consecutive transition to democratically elected governments via like free and fair elections. But because of this, the nature of the political dynamics in the country, what we've come to is somewhat of a hybrid regime. And where there's democratic elected governments and soft interventions, and these dynamics actually lead to competitive authoritarianism in the country as well. So, like, where we see this pursuit of democracy in the country has always been this tension that exists between the military bureaucratic elite known as the establishment and then the political elite that's really representing the citizens in a way. And so, whereas the establishment is concerned with the territorial or ideological defense of the country, the political elite is more associated with the electoral system, so that to ensure succession, policy influence. And that's the tension that we are actually looking at when we try and understand how the pursuit of democracy in the country, how has it come out? So it's whether it's like if you've had a military dictatorship, how was that removed? Do we have and if we do we have elections, and if we do have elections, are they free and fair? Regardless of having elections, are there still elements of authoritarianism very much prevalent? The role of establishment in the entire dynamic, is it completely eliminated or it's not? And till date, we see that that's not the case, because it's still being categorized as a hybrid regime, that regardless of having a lot of freedoms that you associate with it, regardless of having elections, it still falls very much on the spectrum of where we would not categorize it as a quote unquote democracy. It would still be categorized as an electoral autocracy. It would be categorized as a hybrid regime, just because of these elements of authoritarianism that are very much part and parcel of the political sphere.
And in that sense, and if you're categorizing or sort of articulating Pakistan's sort of the Pakistani sort of governments and state as a sort of electoral autocracy, just again for the listener, are there other sort of contexts around the world where that might be quite comparative in that kind of sense, to just give them a sense of how that might sort of be configured?
So in terms of also like in South Asia, if you look at it, I mean, India was characterized, it was a democracy. Now, I think over the years, especially recent years, we've actually moved towards where it's becoming less and less democratic, and you have those elements of authoritarianism that are appearing or emerging as well in the region. So I guess there's also some would argue also, I mean, like not to that extent, but I see where, of course, there are a lot of liberal democracies that are out there that are very much firm in upholding democratic norms and principles. But there is at the same time this shift or move, the shift towards having a lot more conservative forces prop up in countries. And I think that's something that even the West is actually experiencing. They will not be categorized as electoral autocracies by far. No, of course not. They will not be. But the elements of authoritarianism is something that you do see emerging. So a lot of but with regards to electoral autocracies, I think a lot of countries in South Asia, potentially to an extent in East Asia as well, where you would have these elements of electoral governments, but still a lot of elements of authoritarianism that are present. And I think it's just making inways to it. To the extent where it will not. I mean, in comparison, of course, very well-established democracies where they would maybe falter a little bit on certain indices, not others, but they would still very much uphold like this is a democratic government where you do not have that much interference, because here we're talking about interference that is actually there. The role of the state or the role of the establishment that is actually influencing media in a way, or how media framing influences or shapes public opinion. We're talking about the autonomy of the political elite, whether it actually exists, to what extent is there curtailment of freedoms, censorship. And I think that those are aspects that then define identities in society, or that end up defining um, citizens' public opinion across a lot of factors of how they view democracy as well, how they view the establishment as well. And I think it is that because of that fractured history, a lot of identities that have been formed in the country have been shaped by it, because there's never been one dominant discourse on democratization in the country. It has appeared or emerged from various different sources, and that's also, I think, and going forward, I think we'll discuss about it, like the type of democratic discourse in the country that has appeared has changed over the years as well, because it's really of who is advocating for it. Like, what is the context in which it's being discussed, and how the meaning of democracy completely changes. The desire for democracy changes depending on what the actual context is in which this debate emerges.
And I suppose when we think about sort of the Pakistani sort of context, it's very hard to sort of not bring in some discussion of the military here as well, and the military's role in the Pakistani state and in Pakistani democracy. Could you just give us a little bit of a sense of that as well?
Yeah, of course. And I think part of it goes back to this idea of, okay, what is like this military bureaucratic elite that we talk about, that we refer to as the establishment, has been and continues to be a very strong actor in the country, and has a lot of influence in managing the political sphere to an extent. And I think it's and so we see that, I mean, in contemporary politics, or like this year at least, we are debating on an amendment at the moment where in the Constitution, where they're trying to actually provide immunities to certain people in the military, or certain ranks in the military as well. They're trying to roll back on provincial budget to an extent. So there are a lot of these things that are happening in the country in the present time as we talk. Like, it's been like the 27th Amendment in the Constitution that might pass in the next coming days, which is trying to consolidate, in a way, power for some military officials in the country, as while taking back some of the independence from the judiciary, while taking back some of the independence from um, like provinces, or the political elite as well. And I think that shift in power, or the constitutional shift in power as well, um, plays a big role in how we understand politics to be, or how we understand how the political agenda in the country. So military has always been a very prominent part in the country, shaping politics from behind the curtains or in front of the curtains. The fact that we've had multiple dictatorships in the history of Pakistan, after independence, speaks volumes to the role that the military has. The military is not only it's not just limited to the defense aspect of the country. The military is very much involved in the economic sphere, in the political sphere. And that actually just goes on to show how much the military is actually infiltrated in society, right? And it's not only, and it's a showcase of, like, okay, how soft power is actually being maintained as well, right? It's not just, it's just how you've been socialized into accepting certain norms, certain practices, because they're always there, without actually rethinking that this could be connected. Or where is this emerging from? Where is this coming from? So the military is a very key actor in the country, and I think it's a very key actor in the politics of the country as well. And that does shape perceptions very differently, like the public sentiment towards the military, where, I mean, of course, both sides exist. There's a lot of reluctance in criticizing the military as well, while there's also a lot of preference for the military. And I think that the latter part comes from just the fact that we share a border with India. The prominence that's given to the military in the country is, like, because of defense comes from that external threat that's there. That external threat also then allows for the institute to provide coherence or stability within the borders of Pakistan. So it is like it's definitely one of the key actors defining political landscape in the country.
And your sort of analysis takes us across, as you've sort of already mentioned, a period from 2008 to 2018. And 2013 also figuring as a particularly significant kind of point in there in terms of election cycles and so on. Can you take us through those sort of three dates, I guess, 2008, 2013, 2018, and why they're particularly significant in terms of your analysis?
Of course. So 2008 is where you've had, in my lifetime as well, I remember that, where the last military dictator was ousted, and you've had that transition towards an a democratically elected government. So 2008 actually is a very key year in a way where President General Musharraf at that time, who was the chief of army staff from early 2000s as well, actually combined his role with that of the executive as well. Had elections in 2007 just to consolidate that. And then eventually, the reason where the movement against Musharraf actually took root quite extensively was when Musharraf actually abrogated the constitution, removed the Chief Justice of Pakistan. And that's where you had the lawyers movement start emerging about freeing judiciary, independence of how politics needs to be only civilians, politicians. It should not have any interference from the government or from the military. And so the 2008 becomes that very crucial point in Pakistani politics where we are now moving towards, okay, we are done with this moving back and forth between democratically elected governments and military dictatorships, as that happened in the 70s and 80s, but we're moving on and towards that. So that's the last dictatorship that we've had. We have elections, so we force Musharraf actually resigns, have elections, and you have the first government that is being elected post all of this turbulent, fractured history of the transition between dictatorships and because we've of course had civilian democracies in post-independence, but there's never been a consistent democratically elected government, which has been the case post-2008 now. And so that was the discourse on democratization at that point was very much rooted within this context where you have the infringement on freedoms of people or the civilian landscape or the political sphere from the military. And so removing that military intervention, removing that from politics as well, because that's not your role, creating that us versus them dichotomy where you're them being the military that should not be part of of politics at all. So that's the context in which, okay, democracy really talks about freedom of judiciary. It talks about freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, all of that, of how civilians need to be the ones responsible for government, for ruling. That moves on to 2013, where once you've had that big jump in democratic indices as well, where you've had, okay, we removed the dictator, now we're moving towards transitioning towards democracy. 2013 comes where you've already had an a democratic elected government. That's the second government that is being elected in 2013. The narrative on democracy, however, changes because you've had a period of 5 years where you've had a democratically elected government. Now, the narrative in 2013 with new entrants in politics as well, a lot of the way that politics, part of it is that it has also revolved between dynastic families, or Pakistan is notorious for dynastic politics as well. There are two major families. So you have the Bhutto clan, you have the Sharif clan. And so political parties are also divided. So you have PMLN, Pakistan Muslim League Nawaz, that is the Nawaz family. And they've been, and it's just power actually just continues generation to generation. Pakistan People's Party is like Bhutto's family. So Zulfikar Ali Bhutto was a prime minister, Benazir Bhutto His daughter was the prime minister. And now, of course, Benazir's son is now leading People's Party, Pakistan People's Party as well. On the other hand, you have Maryam Nawaz, who is Nawaz Sharif's daughter, who's actually now the chief minister of the biggest province in the country. So you see that politics also, like in Pakistan, like dynastic politics is also very much ingrained in how we understand it. And these are some of the bigger names that you're familiar with, but dynastic politics is very much prevalent in politics across the country. And so the transition of power that's also happened earlier than this period has moved between these two families predominantly who've been in power. So you've had Zulfikar Ali Bhutto from People's Party in the 70s. And you've had, like in the 90s, you have Nawaz Sharif, so PMLN in there as well. And so 2013 is where this new entrant, Imran Khan, who's a former cricketer, makes his way. I mean, he's been, of course, he was involved in politics way before that, but 2013 is this big jump into politics where he creates his political party, or his political party that was present actually gains traction. And he starts selling up this idea of a new Pakistan. So Naya Pakistan, like new Pakistan. And that's what happens in 2013, where the narrative on democracy is not about we want a true democracy to be entrenched in Pakistan. And that is by challenging the incumbents. And the incumbents that he's referring to are these dynastic families that he's referring to. So we see like this transition from democracy being against a military dictator to democracy being against the dynastic politics as well, right? So that's the thing, that incumbents are incompetent. They've not been able to deliver when they were elected. They're not going to be able to deliver. And Imran Khan actually comes up with this new notion of a new Pakistan, like where all these desires of citizens or the welfare of citizens will be provided for. It's a new dawn in history, a new dawn in a new dawn for Pakistan as well. So that's what happens in 2013, the election or the campaigning around 2013. 2018 builds on that narrative because Imran Khan's party then becomes the third largest party in 2013 elections. And that also is like a huge thing, like was able to mobilize mobilize the youth as well with this idea. This is the alternative. We've seen dynastic politicians. Now we're giving chance to someone else. 2018 is where building on that narrative of like, let's consolidate democracy then. Let's move on to really bringing it back in a way. And that's where it's like, okay, this is where we're going to entrench this idea of new Pakistan. It's not just fueling incumbents in a way, but it's actually where we're actually going to create a new Pakistan. And this is where it also was somewhat contextualized because around that time, the sitting prime minister was ousted, and that was, or disqualified, and this was Nawaz Sharif. And Nawaz Sharif was disqualified because of corruption charges. So the Panama cases that were released, his name was in one of those files, and so he was disqualified for being based on those corruption charges, which then fuels this narrative about ridding the country of corrupt individuals. It's ridding it from corruption entirely. We are trying to create our struggle. The struggle that Imran Khan then talked about was not against a person, it was against the system that we're trying to overthrow. And this tug of war that's always existed between the Nawaz clan and the Bhutto clan, that's something that we're trying to move beyond. And we're trying to actually really talk about creating this Pakistan, which is new, which is able to progress and move forward beyond this, where citizens are actually the most prominent individuals in the country, where they're catered for, where we don't have a lot of these. I mean, that's the only way. Like if you choose Imran Khan, you're actually choosing for a new day in a way. And so that desire for what a new Pakistan could look like, because it's not the first time that Naya Pakistan has been used in Pakistan's history. Historically, the national poet of Pakistan, Allama Iqbal, actually used that during the independence movement, where the creation of Pakistan was this homeland for Muslims. It was a homeland for people who could practice their religion, practice their culture with dignity. So Naya Pakistan being articulated by Imran Khan now was also building upon that it's a new dawn that is happening. It's where you can live your lives with dignity, where you can hold politicians accountable, where we are there to serve you and to provide for you, and not to extract from you, which the incumbents have been doing, which they don't care about the citizens. And so it's selling this dream of a greater Pakistan, or making Pakistan great again, where we see parallels as well. If we were to do it, of like Trump's rhetoric of making America great again, also somewhat like glorifies like this national regeneration in a way of like where what we could be, what we can achieve. And it seems like this unattainable dream that we're longing for, that we're actually trying, that we're aspiring for. And that's what Imran Khan is trying to do in the case of Pakistan. It's like selling this dream, which is like this desire of a great Pakistan that would only come into place if he's elected, or that he's the savior in a way, and that's the image that is in there. So that's the context in 2018, where it's like, let's entrench, let's really bring hammer the nail, and this is like the final end where we can actually have a new Pakistan being established.
We'll return to that sort of question of desire and emotion shortly, because it's a really important part of the article in terms of how you drive your arguments through the piece. But I was also interested in some of the sort of practicalities of the research you've done here, because it's based primarily on English language articles in the Pakistani newspapers, covering that time period again from 2008 to 2018. I think it was almost over 1,200 pieces utilized. So can you just tell us a little bit about that kind of practical process of data gathering? And I mean, I still like to think of this as I'm religious myself, so I still like to think this kind of as a field site, in the sense that we have these, this sort of field site of multiple newspaper articles. Can you tell us a little bit about that, of how you went about analysing the data?
Yes. Yes, of course. So, I mean, I randomly chose 3 leading newspapers in the country. So Express, Dawn, and the Nation. And I accessed their online digital archives. And there was a decision of course, choosing English newspapers because, English newspapers and newspapers to begin with, because of course, with the advent of social media, you see like newspaper readership is in decline, and it's in decline across the world, but it still is a very prominent source of information that is present. And it's especially with English newspapers, where it's still prominent within the elite circle. And like in the article, I talk about political elites, and that's not just like politicians, but it's actually individuals who can influence or shape public opinion. And it could be government officials, it could be people or other social actors as well in society. It could be the establishment. It could also be economic elites. All of those. There are multiple types. It could also be journalists to an extent, because they have the ability to influence and shape public opinion. And so with that, English medium then remains very prominent. And I think I just want to also highlight, like, Pakistan is also a country where English is an official language. And although the readership for English newspapers is quite low and it's still restricted, it still is, English newspapers are still widely disseminated across the country, across all provinces. It still has a readership base, and it especially has that readership base of the elite rhetoric, or of elites and people who are also contributing to these newspapers to an extent would fall within that category of elites. And so this paper, when it talks about elite rhetoric, that's what I'm really interested in, of how elite rhetoric really varies across newspapers, whether it's mainstream, like the main section of newspapers, or editors who are contributing to it. How are they actually shaping narratives around different themes and topics? So I chose these 3 newspapers, the most widespread newspapers. There was a 2-step data collection process as well with it. So of course, I, with my RA, actually read through 1,200 newspaper articles to categorize them into 3 broad themes. And so that was the first level of of analysis, or the first step of data collection. So it was just categorizing them into broad themes of politics, socioeconomic affairs, and international relations. Then the second round of coding is where I went through all of those. So we've actually collected data in a software, and then I went over all of those articles just to try and highlight subcategories within that. So an example that I would give, because the majority of the newspaper articles also fell within that, and this process led to like over 1,600 references being made about the particular broad theme, and the analysis is based on all of those references. So the example that is relevant to this article pertains to the theme of politics. And within the theme of politics, I identified 4 subcategories. So elections, route to power, military interference, and democratic transition, which then I categorized as the narrative on democracy and democratization. And so that's a 2-step coding process, 2-step data collection process that led to creation of a database of a lot of statements, paragraphs, phrases, quotes that that refer back to this theme or narrative on democracy and democratization. And I collect newspapers from 2008 to 2018. And the collection, the time period is prior to a general election in the country. I'm interested in electoral discourse specifically. So a month or before the election, and then post election as well. So there's that time period between because campaigning also starts a couple of months before the election. So like between 1 and 3 months is that where it starts. So that's my cutoff period as well, before and after election, just to get a sense of the type of electoral discourse that is present and whether it changes or shifts post election as well. And I do that for 3 consecutive electoral years, so 2008, 2013, and 2018. And that's where the analysis then is built on as well. So understanding the patterns, the recurring patterns, the shift in tone, the shift in the idea of democracy, the evolution of what democracy means in 2008 versus to 2018. And that's something that I pan out in this essay, or in this paper specifically, where I'm like, I look at it from the lens of desire, because post-truth is a political discourse that articulates desire. And I want to apply that framework then in the context of Pakistan to understand, where does this desire really showcase? Does this desire actually showcase in the narrative and democracy? And if it does, how does it showcase in the narrative and democracy? And so there we see varied meanings, varied social identities that are being created around the narrative and democracy, from it being a cry for a liberation against the military dictator, a liberation from incumbent politicians, to actually entrenching and really consolidating a new dawn for a new Pakistan.
Well, that sort of notion of desire. I mean, we've already kind of hinted at in various occasions, and you've expanded a little more here as well. I mean, as I said earlier, it features very strongly in the piece. You're really attending to that sort of emotional landscape, the kind of aspirational or imaginary that might be sort of laid out by particular elites, and how people then become sort of vested perhaps in that in an emotional sense as well. I mean, thinking about that kind of the kind of emotionally loaded content in that you tie in the sort of post-truth kind of position. How does that differ perhaps then from a slightly awkward phrasing, from a sort of pre-post-truth politics, so to speak? Is there something kind of different and distinct here, or in a way, or we're looking at quite a lot of continuity? And you mentioned obviously the concept of Neo-Pakistan, for example. This is nothing new.
So it's slightly different, I argue, and I draw on critical discourse analysis. I draw on Lacanian psychoanalysis to an extent in my research. And I define post-truth discourse actually having certain rhetorical attributes. And those rhetorical attributes refer to lack, which is the aspirational desire; fantasy, the means to fulfill that desire; emotional appeals, to really bring in, to induce this feeling of belonging to that aspirational desire or yearning for the fulfillment of it, that come together to create a phantasmatic logic, which is basically the ability of the narrative to grip the audience, to bring it. And that combines with the context in which this desire is actually being articulated, because the context becomes very important to understand the meaning behind this desire, what it's actually um, advocating for. How is it able to convert common sense into a logical argumentation? The meaning behind this desire that comes into the context becomes important. The political actor articulating that becomes important. And it's a combination of the attributes, the context, the actor that underpin elite rhetoric or the creation of elite rhetoric. And that then influences or shapes citizens' positionality within the narrative. That shapes how citizens perceive the narrative to be, what meaning is being delivered to these people, what desire is being actually sold to these. Are citizens able to resonate with this desire? Do they feel a sense of belonging? Because that's what the rhetoric is trying to really do. And my paper is primarily focused on understanding this elite rhetoric of desire and the identities that is trying to form. And so citizens become an important aspect in this entire equation, because it is the shared identity that is being informed by this desire. It's affect, which is really influencing or how citizens would feel about it. And so and it's applying this framework then to understand a topic, and then to understand whether, and to categorize whether this would be post-truth. So in a way, like in addressing the question of like how this is different, it's different because it's not assuming citizens are passive recipients of information. It's not assuming that it's just emotional appeals, that objective facts don't matter. Objective facts could matter, but it's irrelevant to the discussion, because what matters more is the mobilizing capacity of that desire, of what is being sold to them. So the example in the paper where it's like Naya Pakistan or New Pakistan, that identity is being sold. What does it mean to be a part of a new Pakistan? A citizen of a new Pakistan, what would that entail? And it seems like, okay, this great idea, this ideal that we all like, it's an aspiration. We aspire to be that great ideal. Will we ever achieve that? And I think it's the unattainable nature of that desire that sustains the desire as well, that keeps this conversation going. The fact that it keeps on changing, which leads to how the meaning of democracy keeps on changing because of who the actor is and what they're articulating. What is the desire that they're actually, and so they're competing desires that are present in society. And I think in the paper as well, I talk about it. So on the other hand, we really talk about Imran Khan being like this advocate of Naya Pakistan and everything. Nawaz Sharif, when of course was ousted, and they came up with this vote ko izzat, to give respect to the vote. That's also a part of democracy, right? So like giving, and so what it means to actually give importance to a vote when you place it next to making Pakistan great again, because that's where you think about democratic ideals being entrenched. The meaning of democracy at the same time coming from two different camps means very different to people. The people that it's speaking to, or how people identify themselves with each camp, also varies. Do we want to be in a camp where democracy means respecting vote? Do we want to be in a camp that means that Pakistan is going to become great again under Imran Khan? So that's what this paper is also trying to really tap into, is understanding post-truth as a discourse that is structured or is articulating desire, the different attributes of desire, of how to achieve them, how to convert common sense into a logical argument when we actually analyze textual data. And that's what I'm trying to do. I'm analyzing textual data. It's newspapers in this way. The identity that is being formed, or citizens' identity that is being formed via or vis-a-vis this desire, and how that influences the capacity of such discourses to entrench in society. So that's where it's really pushing against that narrative of how post-truth discourses are always leading to the crisis of democracy. I argue against it. I said in a developing context, in context where democracy you're transitioning towards democracy, it's not consolidated. there such discourses can actually really facilitate democratization efforts, because that's where this idea of what an ideal country, ideal democracy could look like, of how we can mobilize, can become a very effective mobilizing strategy, which we've seen in the case of Pakistan, where the shift from 2000 to 2018, and now we're talking about being in 2025, and that's consecutive democratically elected governments that have come to the fore, and that's where the meaning of democracy keeps on evolving.
Yeah, I mean, it's it's clear from your article. It's a really big part of the argument. Is this counter, I guess, to that sort of commonplace narrative around post-truth being a threat to democracy, and here we have a situation where perhaps, albeit with lots of ambivalences, I guess, where we have these sort of possibilities of actually building democracy. I was curious. I mean, you've talked a little bit through the sort of the three registers that sort of exist, or three layers, I suppose, that exist within the article. On the one hand, you have the sort of, that sort of elite rhetoric of desire, the sort of future that's promised, the aspirational terrain that's laid out for people. And then you have the kind of emotional appeals through which that's communicated, whether that be Naya Pakistan or whether that be, sort of other discursive or affective, processes. And you've talked a little bit, or quite some actually, about the sort of, the positionality of citizens and how they fit in there as well, and how they may or may not sort of see themselves then as sort of, a part of that narrative. But I was curious in that sense about the the sort of sources of data you've used here, because as you laid out, you've used primarily English language newspapers, Express Dawn, and so on. And I just wonder then about the kind of citizens we might be talking about here, because in Pakistan, as in parts of South Asia, English language, of course, is a marker of educational status. It's a marker of class status, and primarily a sort of middle class or more elite sort of class status. I wonder how class then sort of inflects within this analysis, and how that kind of post-truth landscape of affect and aspiration and participation might inflect in populations who are not consuming these particular media.
I think it's a really good point, because I think here, when with regards to choosing English newspapers as well, to an extent, was limiting the sample, and I've still tried to see of how English newspapers are still very much relevant, or the citizens or the type of narrative that is being created is still it's very important, because the focus is on how this elite rhetoric is trying to create an identity of a citizen, of the narrative that is being created. And it's not looking at the citizens' uptake of information. I'm within this particular piece, of course, my other research actually really looks into the citizen side as well, of whether they believe in it, whether they think it's credible or not. But the focus of this particular article is primarily on understanding how elite rhetoric changes and the type of identity that rhetoric is trying to create as well. So that's what the interest is, and the reason for choosing English newspapers then becomes important, because there's a huge predominance of elites contributing to this. There's a huge elite diaspora that's actually, or elite faction in the country that is actually reading or consuming this as well. And it's trying to see whether that elite rhetoric actually changes. And we see that. And I think in my article, I actually talk about how different newspapers as well in 2008, we have Dawn criticizing military rule, having a pro-democracy tone that shifted in 2013 with Imran Khan's Naya Pakistan actually gaining support. The Nation and the Express Tribune actually echoed this by criticizing incumbents and military interference, advocating for true democracy. In 2018, you see these outlets becoming more lenient towards PTI's narrative, emphasizing leadership failures, endorsing the discourse of Naya Pakistan. And so you see that even within elite rhetoric, and it's the very outcome of that is like, if you endorse Naya Pakistan, you are trying to create a very different identity of like what new Pakistan could look like, which is very different in terms of what just having a pro-democracy tone. It's very different than actually being democracy being against incumbents. So the type of people that you're also trying to inform, or the type of narrative that you're willing to create, is shifting as well. So it's like, okay, this is how we see that pattern on democracy evolve in the country as well, from an elite perspective. And then it's not to say, and I think this is something that I actually talk about, like the discourse in democracy is not limited to elites. There are a lot of other players in the country that give space for it. It's the discourse in democracy emerged within student groups. It emerges in religious groups. It emerges in households. All of those actors are very much integral in shaping narratives and discourse in democracy. This paper, however, is very much restricted to understanding elite rhetoric, and just seeing how we understand the meaning of democracy from an elite's perspective, and whether there has been a shift, whether it has remained the same or not. And so, despite it being circulated and being very much popular, influential among the political, military, and business elite in Pakistan, it still becomes very relevant, especially when you look at main sections, when you look at editorials, where you actually see how there are visible changes, or how elite voices are actually engaging with Imran Khan's rhetoric, how how they're actually endorsing or being against it. And that speaks volumes to the way that narratives evolve with time, the way that narratives are able to sell or shape or inform an idea, a social identity. And so it's still, and that's why, I mean, I feel like focusing on post-truth discourses as also being like, okay, we're talking about elite rhetoric of desire that is trying to instill this feeling of belonging to the narrative, instilling a yearning for the fulfillment of it. That's where it's bringing around. That's where it's bringing the citizens into the perspective. It's not like, okay, whether citizens are being directly impacted by it, whether they're consuming it, but that's what they're targeting. That they're trying to sell a desire which could resonate with the citizens, where citizens become an active player in it, where they're able to experience this information, whether they're able to really experience this and feel like they belong to this desire. The fact that it showcases in Imran Khan mobilizing the youth, mobilizing a mass number of people to vote for him in 2013, 2018, he became the prime minister. And that was building on like, okay, how citizens were then brought into the picture of how the desire was able to really tie them in and be like citizens feeling that they belong to it. They belong to Naya Pakistan's dream.
Fascinating, because there's these kind of ideas around aspiration, hope, desire, a community identity, perhaps, featuring sort of work on sort of post-truth politics in other parts of the world as well, in different ways. And clearly the contribution you bring here is particularly original in terms of its kind of rethinking really of that post-truth dynamic. But I wonder if I could ask a question that probably requires a slightly speculative answer. And that's what sort of happens if we take then this sort of analysis that you carried out in Pakistan and we apply it to, say, the US context, where that sort of dialectic between the politics of truth, the politics of post-truth has been very sort of rigidly framed. How might this look if we sort of apply it to, say, Trump's America, sort of the Trumpian sort of politics and MAGA politics in the US, for example?
Thank you for that question, actually. I mean, I think it really does, it's very relevant. And I think it goes back to showing there are two ways to address this. The first one is to try and see of how post-truth in the US became understood as alternative facts or misinformation being on the rise. And it's this dichotomy that we talk about between facts, objective facts, and post-truth. And so post-truth was everything that Trump stood for in a way where he's just hashing out lies and there's nothing true to what he's saying. And that's the way that it's attacking liberal democracies. If we step away from that, and if we say that like what is the type of discourse that Trump was trying to articulate? Because there is a difference that you can make with misinformation, and there's something that is that can actually be verified by factual information and everything. That's something that has been done. Um, so let's eliminate that from the equation. Move on to the second aspect, where we say that Trump's slogans of draining the swamp, Trump's slogans of making America great again, is very much similar to Imran Khan actually articulating Naya Pakistan. It's glorifying that nation. It's trying to generate this great new world, this great new country in a way. And so post-truth there becomes important, so much so that it is related to this rhetoric of desire that is being articulated, which is separate from understanding post-truth, or has been done, which I disagree with, is understanding it as from the lens of misinformation and fake news. And however, and I think this is where it's the second part of the answer becomes important. So despite the parallels that are there, the actor articulating the desire being articulated, is also important within the context that is being articulated in. And so, on the one hand, if post-truth discourses can mobilize and bolster democracy, it can also undermine democracy. With a lot of populist leaders, with the radical right being on the rise across Europe, that is something that you're seeing. Because the type of desire that is being then created, the type of desire that is being sold, has negative consequences, is actually trying to revert from democracy then. It is advocating for something where democracy does not have room. And I think that's the important takeaway as well, because it's like, yes, these are political discourses structured around desire, articulating desire, this unattainable desire that we actually are aiming for and want to achieve. But what is the desire? What is the content of that desire? And is that something? And that is where we put our hats on and actually evaluating on whether this is something that is beneficial or fostering democracy. Is it undermining democracy? What's the vision that we're aspiring? Who are we actually mobilizing at the end of the day? So that's the similarity and difference between Trump and Pakistan. And that is also speaks volumes to the applicability of this framework, because we've talked about post-truth only being discussed in Western Europe or within under the categorization of fake news and misinformation. With this paper that is trying to talk about, with my research in general as well, we're like, let's look at post-truth in a different region, in a South Asian context, in a context where we're talking about developing democracies, where we're talking about hybrid regimes, where we're trying to shift that focus, that regional focus, away from liberal democracies and moving to something that is not quote unquote a democratic setup. Does the nature of post-truth change? Can post-truth actually be a beneficial tool there? And so can it actually be used as a mobilization tool? And so that's something that we do see. And I think the framework is also relevant then, because it is applying to textual data, applying to just understanding political landscape as well, of how does this rhetoric of desire change, adapt itself? What sort of logical argumentation underpin such desire as well? And what does it look like? What does it look like when we talk about Trump's rhetoric versus what we understand as Imran Khan's rhetoric? And can we draw parallels to it or not? And to what extent can we draw it? And the paper actually talks about briefly, I think, in the discussion as well, where you can have that. You do have that division as well. That on the one hand, it's very much aligned, but on the other hand, it's very much different as well, because of the context in which we've come to understand the concept as well. So short answer, for sure. I think it's very much relevant in the US context as well. And it's just looking at the other side of post-truth discourse.
Thank you so much. A reminder to listeners that you can read Anam Qureishi's full article, Talking Post-Truth, Elite Rhetoric on Democracy in Pakistan, in volume 33, issue 3 of Contemporary South Asia. Anam, thank you so much indeed for giving your time today. It's been a real pleasure chatting to you.
Thank you so much for having me on. I had a lot of fun talking about this paper as well.
Thank you again.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.